evening. Thank you for the invitation, for the opportunity to talk about an exhibition that I've been working on really since I was at MOCA. Like most big shows, you kind of noodle it around for years and sometimes even decades. Curators are not that different than artists until you find the right time and the right place for it. And just by way of background, I'm going to just quickly go through a few of the larger thematic exhibitions that I've done, just to sort of create a context of the kinds of group exhibitions that all too infrequently museum curators do not have an opportunity to do. It's as museums have become more and more reliant on visitorship, paid visitorship, there's a tendency to do monographic shows, and that they are, you sort of count on the fame of the artists to create an audience, whereas group exhibitions or thematic exhibitions often are speculative. That's the nature of them, and it takes a great deal, I think, for an institution and for curators to make that kind of commitment to bring a variety of artists together in a way that really enlarges not just how the public understands their work, but often how the artists themselves see their work in relation to other artists, both from their generation and their context. And in that respect, the Helter Skelter exhibition, which I organized in 1991, it was the first show I had originated for MOCA. I should say it really probably, I mean, MOCA gets the credit, but actually it's the Orange County Museum, or as it used to be known, the Newport Harbor Art Museum, that really I did most of my research at. And as a matter of fact, it's absolutely, I'm certain I never could have done the show like thinking about it at MOCA. It was sort of, you have to think about it here and then find another context for it. And it really began with my sort of surprise. I had just gotten the job. I'm sitting in at a board meeting. It was the first board meeting I had attended at MOCA, and there was a kind of an announcement that the TC, the Temporary Contemporary as it was known then, was going to be shut down for several years. And I was like, well, goddamn, this is the place I came to. I mean, I love the Isozaki building, but it's the, it's the TC that, is the, and it was like, oh shit, well, I need to do something really quickly. And I had started with, I think just to annoy the hell out of Richard, because the director of the museum, Koshalik, it was like, okay, well, we're just going to call this the last show, because the first show at the TC was called the first show, and they're closing the place down. And I think it's going to be the last show, and it's going to be a very different view of Los Angeles, much more noir and dark. And actually, I realized then that if you come up with a really atrocious title to start with, actually Helter Skelter didn't seem so bad to Richard after I had become fixated on and yet the show really began with this work by Chris Burden, Medusa, which he had been working on for 4 years, just for himself. And it just kept getting bigger and more extraordinary. And here's this meteorite covered with trains, and it's this kind of 19th century vision of what was going to happen to the world with industrialization. And we now think of trains as being so, and they are. benign and ecological. At the time, it was a scary thing. And watching this piece being made in Topanga, I kind of realized, oh, you know, Los Angeles is not about Venice, which was in some ways Venice, California, dominant at that time. No, it's all in the canyons, the valleys, and the strip malls of Los Angeles. And so the first artist you saw when you came in was Chris, and then behind it is Lynn Folks. And that kind of sort of pairing pretty much, and mind you, these are two artists that really love each other, but it was like, oh, what do these people really have in common? And it was strange because when they all came together, and there was a lot of fighting from really smart artists, you know, going, I don't know why I'm in the show, or why is that person, or that kind of thing. And then it was just like, oh, yeah, I guess, you know, it was obvious to them that Los Angeles had, by the end of the 80s, had really been a really changed community of artists, but it wasn't sort of obvious to the world. And sometimes maybe the thing that's most obvious to all of you as creative people, as artists, and even to curators, are not obvious at all to a much larger public. And that is what we want exhibitions to do. Next, yeah, Charlie Ray's Fall '91, the oversized mannequin, as he put it. It was, he wanted a kind of corporate maternal figure, his words, not mine, that he could have the same relationship he had to his mother, that, you know, so much bigger, sort of, as he put it, the Amazon woman, and just sort of, you kind of cowered. And it had to be all by itself, because when you saw it from a distance, the idea is that, and I don't think it really looks that way, but it was like, oh, it should look normal. And it's only until you come up to your mother that you realize that she looms so much higher above you. In front of it is the work of Robert Williams. And by far, that was the most controversial of all the artists. I thought, you know, I don't know, Tree Fuckers by, you know, Paul McCarthy, or Nudity by or any number of things. You never know what makes people crazy. Certainly these hard rock, heavy metal covers were actively protested by the Guerrilla Girls and any number of feminist organizations. And it was really interesting because I'm certain it was a very well-attended exhibition, a couple of 100,000 visitors, which was huge for a contemporary exhibition. And I honestly think about 25% of them are people who'd never come to the museum before, and it was because of Robert Williams and the combination of doing Guns N' Roses covers, and you know, people like Mike Kelly and Jim Shaw and others said, oh, you know, this guy is great. And it was, you know, I mean, it was really super badly received. And I should say, in fact, the entire exhibition had a terrible reception. I mean, by far, I had never gotten bad reviews up until then. And really, since then, other than some stupid things that I did more politically, I'd always gotten really good. And this show, which was like, you know, the show, it was just, you know, every newspaper, every magazine just said, you know, the worst things, including like the New York Times. There's that famous Eichmann autobiography called The Evil of Banality. And Michael Kimmelman flipped it for the title of the review, and it was The Banality of Evil, Evil of Banality, the Banality of Evil. And it was just like, okay, you know. And I felt actually really confident in the artists. and I felt really confident that the quality of the work would sing true. What I didn't realize was, and Chris Burden, who said, you know, bad press is good press. I got it for all of my performances. He said, just do one thing, Paul. Save all the original reviews in a box. No Xeroxes, no copies, all the originals. And you know, the box kept getting bigger. And he says, and then you can go back years later and say, wrong, laugh, and you know. Nancy Rubens, next, sorry. You know, Nancy and Liz Larner was right behind Nancy over there, and Nancy, which was typical of how she worked, is you'd give the Geffens, I mean, the TC is pretty big, and you give her a big space and say you can see it from above, you can see it from below, all the things. And Nancy, it just kept growing organically out until it was, you know, cantilevered over 3 other artists' works. And I thought, well, you know, that's part of the dynamics of a group exhibition is, you know, people with sharp elbows sort of bumping up against each other. And it was rough and raw. And you know, and I remember one artist saying, you know, you've got to get her to stop. And I said, well, I'm not taking anything down, but I'll encourage her to go in that direction instead, which was about the most I could hope for. That was, while I was working on that exhibition, I was also working on Next. The show that I actually had planned to be the first show I was going to do at MOCA, because MOCA has this extraordinary collection of early pop art from the Ponza collection, and it's museum. It's always good to start with something you've got a good solid loan base from, and I think in a way I knew this was kind of a slam dunk, and already, you know, the Whitney was going to take it, and I think while I was working on it, it sort of made, I figured, well, this is probably, Helter Skelter is not going to go down that well. But I got this second show afterwards, so they're not going to fire me between now and hand-painted pop. Mind you, there had been, you know, 2 chief curators at MOCA previously who had lasted 18 months for one and 2 years for the other, and so I wasn't really anxious to, you know, to have a short run. Not expecting that I necessarily would be there 22 years, but it was like, okay, at least I've got hand-painted pop in the works, and this wonderful Roy Lichtenstein, you know, where, you know, it's a sponge in a way, just wiping away, you know, abstract expressionism. This sort of taking the notion of the gesture and just moving it out. Next, please. And these early works by, they're so crazy, by Warhol, and you know, Warhol was a little, he'd seen the, he was doing these independent of Roy, and then when he saw, you know, Roy's work, it was like, oh God, you know, there's so much better. But you look at these and you realize how much Warhol took, you know, seriously the idea is like, oh, I can be a pop artist one day, and I can be an abstract expressionist the next. And he would like literally say this to people from like the New York school just to make them insane. And that both reverence for and wiping away that history, that's what makes, we call them transitional periods, but it's actually, they're not transitional periods. They're like breakthroughs, and it's like a very fundamental change took place. And certainly these early years of pop art, in a sense, before all of the artists became aware of what everyone else was doing, was a really extraordinary moment. And next, please. And it was one that no doubt was, in some respects, epitomized by Rauschenberg and his combines, and the combination of very specific iconography, drawing from popular culture, cartoons, found objects, paintings, and that, you know, really wonderful sort of encrusted painterliness. And he was, you know, the man who erased de Kooning, but he did so in a way out of great both reverence and love. And I always like to point this out for all of you who, you know, are always sort of comparing who's better, Jasper or Bob or Jasper. And look at that upper right-hand corner. You see that softball with a fork? That was before Jasper ever did anything quite like that. And so there is something in Rauschenberg's work that is like, yep, he just opened it up and let somebody else just move it and love it. And this was certainly along with, you know, the Oldenburgs and the Rosenquists, a very good beginning point for this next thematic exhibition. Next, please. And Laurie was talking about Out of Actions. This was the show, a little bit like the show I'm going to tell you about now that I'm working on. It was a long, long time coming, and I have to say I was at MOCA for 7 years before it could be realized. But you know, it's always best you wait until you get all your ducks lined up and you can do it right, because if you do it early and you don't do it right, you've blown it. You never get another chance to do it, and it's not done. That said, I don't think I'll ever do a harder exhibition than Out of Actions. It had, you know, like 140 artists, 400 individual works. It was, you know, the unified theory of painting, sculptures, installations, objects that came out of performance. And it was in some ways a very simple but rather sort of radical thing, because a lot of the performance people would say, well, you know, I'm a performance artist. It's you know, it's about the performance, and others would say, oh, you know, maybe it's kind of like a leftover. It was like a remnant. But I found as I was doing research, everyone I went to, and I would, you know, go to them about this performance where you could see this thing was used. All of these artists, 20, 30, 40 years later, still had this stuff that they had made, you know, and so maybe the art world didn't quite know what to do with it, and certainly the relationship of museums and collectors to performative objects has evolved extraordinarily over the last 20 years. But at the time, it was like, oh, these were just things that they were saving and loving. And I put Mr. Shiraga crawling around in the mud on the cover. The back cover is actually of equal. It wraps around. It's a photographer taking pictures of Shiraga crawling around in the mud. And the relationship between the mud and then the foot paintings that he was doing simultaneously is why this artist associated with Gutai was very much part of this sort of movement that was happening globally without people, in a sense, being conscious of it in terms of the relationship between time-based activities, performance, and the objects that come out of it. Next, please. And there it is, Shimamoto, Fontana, and John Cage. And each one of these works were, I mean, obviously the gold screen was really that notion of breaking the two-dimensional surface, also history, Japan, gold leaf screens, but it was, you know, you created a really tight gold surface, something that was absolutely perfect, and you know, just physically going through it. And I very much wanted it, and it was essentially, it was the same year as Pollock was doing drip paintings on the floor, and I just, you know, had works from Italy, from Japan, from the United States, and all of these things very differently, but conceptually you understood that there was this wonderful relationship that artists, they kind of know instinctively where things need to go. They're just not necessarily sure that it's going to make sense to anyone else. And sometimes by the time they see it is making sense to other artists, they go, oh, well, good, I'm moving on to the next thing. But, and so it's a wonderful thing when you can kind of, in retrospectively, bring these things back to the original intent and ambition that the artist had. Next, please. These are great. Ligia Pape, and they are performance sculptures, and they are having to do with sensory and going into a kind of a dark inner space and letting these objects just, and they're in a sense, their cosmic qualities permeate and go through you. Next, please. So, yeah, this title actually turned out to be a little harder than Helter Skelter, and it actually was interesting. It took the head of the LA Times, a very conservative person, finally to convince the other trustees that no, you're not going to get sued because you have the word ecstasy in a title. It's not condoning, taking drugs, but it had certainly to do with altered states of reality. And it's certainly, it's a show I've come to, there's a sort of the next generation in LA, those who never saw Helter Skelter. This was maybe 12 years later. For many of these young people, it was the first show they ever saw, and it was their way of seeing themselves, and it was a kind of a immersive game changer. Next, please. So Erwin Riddell and these extraordinary light diodes that I don't know. I mean, this was way before Olafur, but I saw what was happening. People would not just come back once or twice, but they would come back for hours at a time and just line the space around there and just sit there and look at it. And I thought, whoa, this is like a whole nother kind of audience. And next, please. So this is the upside down mushroom, psychotropic mushroom room by Karsten Haller, which was a real bear to get. He had made it for the Prada Foundation, and they had never lent it, I think, before or since then. And it's a crazy upside down room that the mushrooms. Yes, the same mushrooms that Sigmar Polke painted in the 70s in his psychotropic photographic works, they would slowly rotate around. That, along with Charlie Ray's slowly rotating table, gives you an idea of what's next, please. Roxy Payne and his field. Yes, I know you all know about the trees, but this mushroom project, and I think there was 1,500 and some odd, each individually made, meaning each mushroom was unique. It was well, gee, why wouldn't you have cast 10 of this and 10 of that? No. That is an artist. That took that kind of dedication, and it's an exceptional piece. Next, please. And under the support of the Getty Foundation, a series of 40 or plus large-scale exhibitions were organized under the rubric of Pacific Standard Time, and it was really an opportunity for a lot of museums in the region to go and look at their own history, something that I would imagine Miami's getting ripe for too. And you know, he's trying to sort of tease away the import culture from the export culture, and in a sense, you don't make the history, you just research it, and you give it value, and you give it love, and you give it a context, and then it certainly makes a difference. So Under the Big Black Sun looked at California art from 74 to 81. It was a very short period, and it was really about, in many respects, how politics, more than anything, entered into the dialogue. It was a moment of real collapse. You know, Nixon. Oh, that was one of the great objects I had in the show. I got Nixon's original letter of resignation, which, I don't know if any of you know this, it's when a president resigns, they write to the Secretary of State, and that was Henry Kissinger. And it's, you know, Dear Secretary of State, I am resigning. One sentence about the resignation, and it, you know, and you see in the lower corner it says HK, and it has the, you know, in Kissinger's own initials, and it has the time and the date in which he received it. And it was like that, and the pardon, the Ford pardon, which was kind of an outrage, right? I mean, it was a pardon for everything. I mean, if you read the pardon, it was everything he might have done before, during, and after. It was like the complete and total pardon. And that pretty much, I think, was, you know, a kind of political collapse. It was sort of like, oh, you see, there aren't really rules for everybody, and we really do live in a country that is, you know, absolutely without a moral center. And you had that, and you had Carter, you had, you know, Jerry Brown in California, and it was the beginning of this, almost like the beginning of the end of like wedge politics, and things just, it was no longer about bringing everybody together, but it was about splintering everything apart. And to some degree, that is still the case. And out of that, you know, movements like the punk movement, next please, began, and you have these wonderful zines. That Helter Skelter had nothing to do with the exhibition. It was, you know, these are Raymond Pettibone's zines, and the crossover between the music world, the punk music world, and drawing and illustration, and works that came out, next please, that were really public protests. And that was like Suzanne Lacey, who literally, on a large map of Los Angeles, identified over a period of just a week every single rape that had taken place and where it had taken place in Los Angeles. And it was a way of mapping out the atrocities. I mean, one of the worst police departments, and in fact, no, in a sense, protection for women. And she, in a very clear and a very didactic way, gave substance, visual substance, to the numbers, and you saw it. You saw what neighborhoods it happened in, and it was like a great work of art, a way visually of absolutely understanding the crisis that was and still is. Another work that, in a way, made in a very factual way, and in some ways, sort of the flip side of politics, is Chris Burden's The Reason for the Neutron Bomb, originally made for an exhibition at the Hirshhorn. And it was at the moment when there was a lot of discussion about, you know, the neutron bomb, and you know, the neutron bomb was going to be the U.S.'s way of sort of stopping the tanks through sort of frying all the electronics on the border. between Eastern Bloc and Western Europe. And what Chris did is, next please. Sorry, needed to catch up. What Chris did is he found out exactly how many tanks were on the Soviet side of the border, and it was huge. It was something like 20,000. And each one of these nickels has a little match on them, so they're like a little tank. And you kind of looked at it and went, oh, okay. Well, it wasn't like Chris was not being unclear about, you know, what is the reason for the neutron bomb? Well, he was giving a kind of, knowing it would upset the art world, it was politically absolutely the wrong thing to do. But it was like, okay, guys, but you know, that is the reason for the neutron bomb. There are all those tanks there. Next, please. The last exhibition I did for MOCA was Destroy the Picture, Painting the Void. And it began in a way with looking at this period sort of from the 50s and the 60s, not as kind of pure abstraction, but as really representing a kind of social change in the post-war period that, you know, World War II pretty much made the globe a lot smaller than anyone had ever imagined. And the dialogue and the kind of impact that war had on the subsequent generation of artists was in a way profound, in that there were experiences that artists had in Japan and in Italy and all over the world that they shared. And it was that sense of, we have now gotten to the point where we are able to completely destroy the world, and there was that sense of void. This beautiful work by Burry, which is the cover, and here was a guy who had been a doctor in the Italian front line and had not made any works of art until he had been captured, ironically sent to West Texas, to the very town of Marfa, and in some of the very buildings that Donald Judd, that was part of the encampment for the Italian military. And it was there that he, like a doctor, began to sort of sew and stitch these burlap bags, the skin of this broken surface, back together. And next, please. And Shiraga, with a hunted boar, using in a way the traditions of Japan, covered it with this kind of visceral, both blood and guts. And next, please. And here you have both Shimamoto and Robert Rauschenberg, made exactly the same time. I mean, literally, you know, within months of each other, no knowledge of it, but that notion of breaking down the surface and breaking down the support for painting is also that kind of sort of anarchy that existed both in Japan, and the Gutai, it was maybe the one period, you know, the emperor was no longer a god, and it was such a small world in some way, where somebody like Rauschenberg, within 2 years of Burry making those works, Burry was already showing in New York. I mean, it was quite phenomenal. And Rauschenberg went off to Italy, among other things, with Twombly, to go visit Burry, because he had seen this. And the opening show I organized for Hauser and Wirth, A Revolution in the Making, and next, please. And that's a detail of Hesse which I was very fortunate to be able to get both this floor work and the wall work, which belongs to the Berkeley Art Museum, and it was the first time these two works were back together since they had first been made. And this is sort of the, next please, the Grand Bank Gallery with Louise Bourgeois, Ruth Asawa, and a whole wall of these Lee Bontecues, and people like Lee and Salvatore Scarpita. They were in Italy during this period, and that language that they shared came out of this post-war period. Here you have wonderful Linda Benglis. Next, please. Linda Benglis and a Kusama, almost snake-like form, and Heidi Buchholz. And these works just looked so, I think, wonderful together, and it was really an opportunity to bring together, oddly enough, for the first time, so many artists who were working in that area of both new procedures, new processes, new forms, and creating something that very much reflected both their own body and an extraordinary sense of the interaction between craft and sculpture and materials that in some respects were maybe both ephemeral in nature, but captured, I think, quite extraordinarily the poetry of life itself. So now, next please. So the work the show I've been working on is an exhibition of contemporary history painting. And oddly enough, there really has not been a serious history painting show in about 150 years. There are, first of all, history painting to a large degree was like written out of modernism. It's a mistake to do because there's so many extraordinary examples. I mean, what's our most, among them, as New Yorkers at least, among our most beloved Picasso is Guernica, and that's absolutely a history painting. And you start looking at it, you realize that, yeah, it got written out in the 19th century, and nobody's kind of put it back in, but in fact, artists, and I think this show argues very vigorously, have been doing history painting from the 60s to the present that represent extraordinary world events that the artists wanted to own themselves. It is, the world is watching, but it's their history. They want to own it. And that is in maybe many ways the very fundamental change that history painting has taken, because the church, the patron, the state often controlled the iconography of history painting. With the big break, of course, is Goya, and he is, I think, beloved by most of these painters because he in a sense, took ownership of history, and it was, in a sense, his responsibility, an artist's individual responsibility, to write history as they see it and as they understand it to be. This doesn't mean it has to be truth. There is no truth. Everyone, in a sense, knows history is written by those who write it, and artists have that responsibility and have stepped up to it. It's just not something we seem to fully recognize. So here's a painting by Anselm Kiefer from the Operation Sea Lion series. Next, please. And this is The Walk by Luc Tuymans. So the exhibition's divided into about a dozen historical periods, not when the work was made, but by the subject of the work. And here's this very famous walk between Mussolini and Hitler. And this is done in 1992. It's years later, but this walk, this image, this memory this changed the world, at that moment, that walk. Next, please. And here's one of the death camps by Sigmar Polke. And there's no doubt Polke was looking at Kiefer doing his Hitler paintings, doing Operation Sea Lion, and Sigmar made something so beautiful and so kind of romantic and so terrible and frightening, and an extraordinary series of like 7 of these camp paintings that are in a way was with his return to painting. They came out of this series. Next, please. So simultaneously, you have Via Selmans. This is in the mid-'60s, and this is really the Cold War. You have Suspended Plane, and you've got, next, please. Gerhard Richter's Bombers, and made within 2 years of each other, clearly dealing with different views, one from German airplanes, the other from American airplanes, but in many ways the same war. And to me, it just seems so interesting. A Lithuanian American, Via Selmans, right, coming European, ending up in the United States, and Richter going from east to west. They both, in a sense, understood how this war changed their lives too. It is, their history again. Next, please. So this is leaving Europe, looking now at post-war Asia, and this is probably the greatest Lynn Folks painting ever done. It's, he worked on it for I think about 6 years, yep. And it's called Pop, and as you can see, December 6th, and the father is in shock. The children are with him, and he is Superman, but Japan has bombed Pearl Harbor, and America is in the war. And next, please. And this, of course, is the other side. This is an extraordinary painting by Yves Klein of Hiroshima. It is directly taken from photographs that were made of those figures that were literally embedded into the wall of Hiroshima, and those figures became, in a sense, something in his own work which had been seen as poetic in some cases, sexual in some places, musical in other places. This became something really profoundly political. At the same time, you've got other representations of women by Nancy Spiro. Next, please. And this extraordinary series of mourning women irradiated, again, Hiroshima seen from the standpoint of the women themselves mourning the loss of their families and their children. Next, please. And this is the beginning of the Cold War, and you've got everyone from Roy Lichtenstein doing Wham, next, please, to Neil Jennings' Them and Us, pretty clear. Next, please, to Wolf Vastel's Flower Power, and the bombings going on, to James Rosenquist. Next, please. F-111, and both the kind of the end of this period of quote Camelot, and the bringing together of both popular culture and the U.S. military. Next, please. And this is, of course, Camelot, Rosenquist, the president-elect, the sense of the possibilities of the future. Next, please. And retroactive series of 7 paintings that Rauschenberg did that in some ways they are love, they're very much in love with Kennedy and what he represented, but also in some ways already seeing the fragility of this presidency, and then not to be unsettled. Next, please. But you have Ed Paschke's Purple Ritual, and there's the assassin for Lee Harvey Oswald, who assassinated the president, and making a kind of emblematic stamp out of him, and that. Next, please. That was the week that was, and I promise you, I go out of my way sometimes not to include Warhol in shows, because it's just like, really, there are not. Warhol was one of the great history painters, and you will see him in several cases, and there was nothing, subtle about. He was in mourning with Jackie and the whole country, and you see a portrait of her through all these different times, and of course the blue was where all the Jackie portraits ended up after the assassination. Next, please. And this is from the 1980s, and it's a much younger generation. Raymond Pettibone saying, as a young man, they shot the president. That's what we all heard, and it was like, they shot the president, and Raymond says he's going to do a big mural of this, because it's such an extraordinary and tragic image. The next section, next please, is dealing with race riots and the kinds of explosive changes that were taking place politically in the United States during this period, and these red, white, and blue. Warhol, you get it. It's like, this is America. But next, please. I know it's going to kind of blow your mind that Norman Rockwell and Andy Warhol were actually writing to each other. These works are from exactly the same year. This is the murder in Mississippi. Warhol was also representing what was happening in Mississippi. This is based on a photograph, on many photographs that were taken of this incident. And Rockwell was not doing this for a cover of a magazine. This was not a commission work, but this was a major piece, obviously a little Goya-esque in its, but it wasn't just for Warhol to do, and it wasn't just for Norman, meaning all of these artists, they wanted to own what was their American history and the sense of unbelievable tragedy that was going on. And next, please. This is Leon Golub, Vietnam War. Most extraordinary, that and the Mercenaries, these extraordinary dioramas of the tragedy of Vietnam. Next, please. And this is a work by Malcolm Morley, a first aid center in Vietnam, 1971. It's just, you talk about, the confusion, literally the mist, the smoke of war, and you look at this, and it's just clotted with a kind of both, flesh and burnt landscape. Next, please. And this is Richard Artswager, same year, hospital bed, hospital ward, right out of Vietnam. So each one of these artists, we like to think of them, this is who this artist is, this is who that artist is. These are absolutely political works, and they are something that and this was 30. Next, please. 30 years later, we all know this image, and this is by Yan Pei Ming, and this image, seen by a Chinese artist, knows that was the moment when the war was over. in Vietnam for the, like that picture, that atrocity of what was going on in the street, that photograph just finally here's a Chinese artist who understood it as much as, of course, maybe more so than we did even in the United States. Peter Saul's Saigon. I'm sorry, next please. Peter Saul's Saigon. Wish I had a better picture. Next please. San Clemente by Philip Guston. Yep, that is what you look like after you've, that's the portrait of Dorian Gray sort of in reverse, and that's what you look like after it's all over. Next, please. Sonia Guterres, and this is the beginning of a whole section dealing with both colonialism and the rise of generals, and it's sort of like you have the colonial masters coming out, you have the generals rising up, and these are, we'll keep saying homeland. Speaking of which, this is by Luke, next please, Luke Toymans, and another homeland and colonialism. And when the colonial masters leave, they leave havoc. They've created a structure that is so profoundly undemocratic that it goes sort of from bad to worse. And everyone says, oh, you see, the colonies weren't, the colonialism wasn't so bad. Well, no, they left this. Next, please. The Weeping Wall by, oh, yeah, that's Toymans. Next, please. The Weeping Wall by Marlene Dumas. Next, please. Cherry Samba, and then, next, please. An African artist and a Los Angeles artist. I was king when I met the queen. Mogosi, Democratic Intuitions. Next, please. Next, please. Eric Bulatov, New York, Russian artist, did these in 1989. Next, please. Nickelodeon by Andrea Geni. Next, please. Ronald Ophius, the July 1995, The Death of Eden. Next, please. Torak Alantis. Next, please. Freedom Under the Flag by Hissam Romanian. Next, please. Ganji Mao Zedong, Red Grid number 2. Next, please. The Execution by Yu Mujian. Next, please. Art and Power, Great Criticism. Next, please. Jingxing Airport. Obviously, we've moved from Russia into China. Next, please. The Battlefield Realism, 18 Arats, 2 parts of 18 panels, by Louis Xingzong. Next, please. This is the Student Protests, and this is a Michelangelo Pistoletto. No to the raise of the tram fare. Literally, 1965 student protests about raising it, but it was really about the politics of Italy at the time, and it was like, okay, we're going to go out and we're going to protest the raising of the tram fare, but actually what we're protesting is Italian politics at the time. Rita Donut, The Belfast Boy, and next, please, from 1973. one of the kind of crucial early pictures of the Troubles. And then she inspired her husband, next please, to begin his whole series by Richard Hamilton, also dealing, quote, with the Troubles. This is called The State. And the next please, Gerhard Richter, the Bonner Meinhof Dead Tote series. Next please. Basquiat, Hollywood Africans, and we're now dealing with a period in the 80s and the real change of both identity politics. And David Ronerevich, next please. Untitled from 1984. Next please. Kerry James Marshall, Bang, also 1994. Next please. Nicole Eisman, The Triumph of Poverty. Next, please. Carol Walker, Slavery, Slavery. Next, please. Nina Chanel Abney. Next, please. Secretary of State, Luke Toymans. Next, please. Luca Korashvi, 9/11. It's a beautiful, kind of extraordinary painting. I mean, people jumping out, and then these wonderful, formal pinstripe painting. I mean, color field abstraction meets modern politics. This extraordinary work by Francis Elise. Don't cross the bridge before you get to the river. Next. Next, please. Gaddafi's Corpse, October 20th, 2011. And I think Ming did about 25 of these. Wilhelm Sansel, this is his, next please, Gaddafi picture. Next please. Abu Dhabi in 1989, Fernando Botero did 9 pictures in 2006 when it was like right, and they are as, I know Botero, whatever you could say about, they are extraordinary. They are so powerful and so tortured. The exhibition will have about 65 artists and about 160 works in it. And there'll be probably a dozen commissions of new works, bringing it up to today. There are whole sections dealing with neo-nationalism, globalism, what's going on, migration, and I hope all of you will have a chance to see it when I realize it in the next few years. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming tonight.